how would you see someone of African American descent with that experience related to a mask that was clearly not in their direct experience? You know, if you have someone who grew up here, who may have grown up in the 1800s, this would be it would be just as foreign to the slave as it would be to the slave owner. But how would we then, several generations from that point, be able to draw on this and somehow create it and claim it? Is that legitimate? Is that really, is that effective? Do you think that really represents the background of a black artist who comes from Boston, Massachusetts, who went to school in Paris and in New York and in DC?
I think when I look at art, I'm always interested in knowing more. I mean, that to me is the whole key to life and key to survival, is through art and knowing artists and how they juxtapose even their extremely white life as an African American, but also wanting to know their history and their root system, and having, even if it's in the DNA or in your cellular memory, but these images and these colors and patterns and stuff. So to me, this is a phenomenal artist working through history, working through knowing or wanting to know.
Wanting to know. I grew up in a church with it was led by a Haitian pastor, and the majority of the population was actually Haitian. And the language that most of the services were actually a split between English and Creole. So it was really interesting growing up with that. So when I see things like this, I immediately think about like juxtaposition and this experience that's somehow shared. So I think based on what certain people have said, and there's a consensus that even though this is not directly her experience, it's not directly where she comes from or what she's related to, it still has meaning, it's still effective, it's still an honest piece of work. Am I overstepping that, or would you all agree?
I think with her being African American, she would want to research her background and pull together a lot of things from that, and I think in her art would express her background.
So what if she did a test, or a genetic test, and it turns out like 80% of her roots are Scottish? Does it still, and there's no background related to Haiti. She has genes related to Africa, but aside from that, she's pretty much, still.
I mean, I grew up in the South. So much of my culture comes from Africa.
Yeah.
Through that, it comes from Africa. It connects me. So
it's the experience.
She's from New England, I'll forgive that.
Well, I mean, we've got to give her some credit for, having some of these thoughts too. If what you're going to do is make this heritage claim, it's interesting that she's given us a mask and more or less caricatures of that heritage.
Yeah.
Like, to me, that's, if she's making the claim, she's acknowledging that it might be a tenuous one.
I see. So the amount of effort put into the work.
Well, not necessarily the effort, but the subject matter. That it's a mask, that it's something that's, shielding, separate.
I see.
If it's an authentic claim, she's kind of giving us a wink about what she's claiming is caricature, mask, things that are kind of inauthentic in a way.
A mask works in two ways. Either it can work to shield and present an image forward, or it can work to shield the body and then present a true self, which I feel like is more indicative to how we think about Native American culture, in the sense that you put on a headdress and therefore it indicates a certain innate self, or it indicates a certain innate spirit within you and then enhances that. And so I think that if we're talking about the mask, we have to think of the duality of it, how it's shielding or how it's enhancing. And I think that the way that she's layering these and the way that we think about her maybe imposing on the faces, since they tend to have general features, I think that she's kind of playing with that. To what extent are we seeing ourselves in this, and to what extent are we shielding ourselves in it?
This is the most interpretation based on whether it's an honest representation of her life. It seemed we should talk about the painting and not whether she lived in New York or Washington or wherever. I'm just curious why we feel that is such an important part of this painting.
There was a debate on whether, in creating art and telling the story of African Americans and telling the story in general of these artists and their lives, of how much influence should Africa actually have on this work. Because is there really a genuine connection? Is this really a part of our story, or are we just appropriating it? I actually was online the other day, and I read an article that was basically from a young lady who she grew up in the African country. She's a writer, and she was criticizing African Americans for appropriating like African patterns or specific African designs or masks into their own look, into their own culture, into their own style, because she said, this really doesn't belong to you. This really isn't reflective of your experience, or you really don't understand the roots of it or what it means or where it comes from. So just as there may be blame against there may be blame against white people when they appropriate a certain tribal pattern in clothing from Urban Outfitters or something like that. They're like, well, you guys are doing the same thing. You're taking stuff that you don't really know what it is, or you don't really have a real connection to it after all these generations, and you're claiming it for your own.
If you take that line of thinking, if you're from Africa, you should only do art that reflects African themes. Mm-hmm. Well, that's a rather silly thought.
I'd be out of the job. I couldn't paint. I wouldn't be able to draw anything, man.
I mean, that's a pretty restrictive notion that you should only, if you grew up in a farm, you should only draw pigs and cows and not streetcars. I mean, that doesn't make any sense. I mean, you should be able to look at a painting and say, is that a good painting or not? You shouldn't have to say she's poor or rich or suffered or didn't suffer. The question is that a good painting? Is that a good painting? And you shouldn't have to know whether they're from Africa or 95 or 15.
What
Right,
makes
in
a good
America, we used to
painting?
have a culture in which we took for granted things that existed behind an artwork and acted like there was aesthetic purism, and we should only look within the frame when we were actually ignoring social realities that existed behind it. And I think a lot of politically progressive artists have wanted to bring talk of the real world into how we look at the actual work, because it has something to do with it.
Yeah, but
Well, one of the power of real art, is, in my opinion, is that if you just look, if you can appreciate just for what's inside the frame, and don't worry about what's going on in the world outside, because that's beyond the art.
But-
Just look at the art and see what it means about the world outside.
But would our conversation be much different if Lois was white? Would this conversation right now
Yeah, but-
be completely
but the
different
problem
if the
is-
artist was white?
the whole problem with this whole thing is that the only thing the artist is giving us, given the context of just looking at the image, is the images that she puts on the frame and the title, the date, the name, and the time period. Then, that's all unless you know the artist personally or if you read about the history, you're bringing in everything else. And so you have to look at it, just as you were saying back there, you have to look at it as what's here, what's the name of the artist, what's the title.
I think that the idea that you can only consider what's inside of a frame comes to the idea that when an artist paints or writes, or uses any kind of medium, that's coming from some kind of ethereal genius that is separate from the life that they live every day. And I think that it's to take art out of the context of life when art is a direct expression of and a part of life. I spent all last semester studying French colonial literature. So these are very much narratives that I've read about and I'm familiar with. Interested to hear impressions of those. Just some things to offer about what conversations were around this period in France and in Haiti at the time. There was a lot of discussion of Black beauty and ownership of Black beauty, of whether or not you can own, whether or not you can pretend to be European, pretend to be white, and value yourself according to that French system, and still own your blackness and still own negritude, and find value in that.
When I'm not getting to make art, do a little legal work as a lawyer. And when I was in, when I was in law school, there's the big theory with constitutional law of how to interpret the Constitution. Whether you look strictly at the document, you get everything you can get out of those words, out of the articles, out of the language of the Bill of Rights and the amendments and what have you, and that's it. Or whether you have to look at the context of where the framers were writing, you know, is this law really applicable to this situation, or was this interpretation that's worked for so many cases at this point, does it not work because the framers or the writers or the judges that created the precedent didn't consider this situation, and they clearly wouldn't have seen it as, you know, it's reconcilable. And so that's really interesting, because I thought I got away from that debate when it comes to art, but it clearly is still really important. Her name is in it. And so, and then she also wrote Haiti in the painting. So it's almost, for me, I'm the type of person, oh, I gotta investigate that. I gotta Google this woman, I gotta Google Haiti. I'm guessing that's 1980. I gotta see what's up with that and then try to put it in the context of this. I think it's just, you're gonna see as far as you care to see. And some people, they have enough knowledge where they see a certain link, they see a certain work, they have the experience or the understanding or a biblical knowledge like Austin, where in understanding of African cultures and ancient Egypt, where they see this pattern and then they can just put it together for themselves. And then there are other people that they're going to see this almost community, and then they're going to notice this head, and they're going to notice these three heads. They're going to see a certain sense of beauty, a certain sense of elegance. And then they're going to make their interpretation off of that, or they're going to try to see, what do these figures represent? Why are there only four? Why are there not more? Why are there not less? What I think is interesting about this piece is just the vibrant color. Like, I'm very easily pleased. So if I see a bunch of colors, I'm good. I'm halfway in the door. And what I think is interesting is that in this culture, as you may notice in African American art, and in art in general, but specifically with cultures that derive from Africa and that are inspired by that, there's and this is kind of global. It's not just limited to Africa, but I'm just speaking in this context. You notice all these vibrant colors and all this energy, even in the sense that even in these communities that may suffer horribly, that may be impoverished, that may deal with a lot of pain and a lot of trials and tribulations, there's still this beauty that is just evident, and it's almost regal, which I think is consistent with her upbringing.